The lights in the shop came on at 5:13 every morning, and they came on because Garrett Hollow was already inside. He didn't need an alarm. He hadn't used one in 20 years. His body simply woke at 4:50, put on the same canvas work pants hanging on the hook by the door, brewed half a pot of coffee in the dark kitchen, and drove the 12 minutes from his house on Maple Creek Road to the shop on Dunmore Street in Ashford, Ontario. The town was quiet at that hour. The Tim Hortons on the corner hadn't even opened yet. The shop was called Hollow Millwork. It had been there for 31 years, first under his father's name and then under Garrett's, and it smelled the way it always had. Wood dust and linseed oil and something else that didn't have a name, something earned through decades of early mornings and sawdust in the hair. He ran his hand along the edge of a half-finished cabinet frame on the bench and felt where the joint needed another pass. He picked up the plane and started. That was how most days began. Just the work and the quiet and the particular satisfaction of fitting one piece of wood against another until the seam disappeared. His daughter, Lily, was 9 years old that winter. She stayed with him 3 days a week and every other weekend, which was the arrangement he and his ex-wife Sandra had settled into after the divorce. A quiet, practical arrangement that suited them both and confused no one except Lily, who was still at the age where she thought arrangements were negotiable. She would leave her mittens in his truck on purpose so he'd have to call Sandra and come by. He always did. He made her oatmeal with brown sugar in the mornings she was with him. He drove her to school in the old green pickup. He helped her with her science projects at the kitchen table, and he was patient about it, even when she changed her mind about the topic 3 times in 1 week. He never raised his voice with her. The neighbors on Maple Creek Road didn't know much about Garrett Hollow, but they knew he was the kind of father who shoveled his walk before his daughter woke up so she wouldn't have to walk through snow. He had been seeing Joanne Price for about 8 months before things changed. Joanne worked at the regional office of a property development company based out of Hamilton. She was 44, attractive in a precise, considered way, and she had been the one to ask him out the first time, which he had found disarming and which had made him like her immediately. She laughed easily. She was direct. He appreciated directness. For the first few months it was good. He cooked for her. Roast chicken, braised short ribs, the kind of food that took an afternoon and filled a house with smell. She brought wine she knew something about. They drove up to Collingwood one weekend in October and walked the trails, and she had held his hand the whole way without asking or explaining, which was the kind of easy intimacy he'd thought he was too old to find again, but somewhere after Christmas things shifted. He noticed it first as a small thing. She had asked him, casually, what the shop brought in annually. He had given her a general answer. Comfortable, he said, more than enough. She had nodded, but her eyes had moved in a way that registered something as insufficient. He hadn't thought much of it then. Then there was the dinner at Luca's, the Italian place on King Street that had recently started getting written up in the Hamilton Spectator. She had wanted to go, and he had agreed. They arrived and the host had looked at his boots. Clean work boots, the best pair he owned. And at Joanne's dress, and the host had arranged his face carefully and led them to a table near the side wall. Garrett didn't care about tables. Joanne did, though she said she didn't. He'd overheard her in the restroom line that evening on the phone with someone. A friend, he assumed. She said, "He's great, he really is. But I don't know. He runs a millwork shop." A pause. I know, but it's not exactly." Another pause. "I'm not shallow, I'm just being realistic." He had gone back to the table and poured himself some water and waited for her. She came back smiling and asked what he'd been thinking about. He said he'd been thinking about the joint on a cabinet frame that was giving him trouble. She had looked at him for a moment and then smiled again, but differently this time, the way people smile when they've confirmed something they already suspected. In February, she told him about Derek Castle. She said it like she was delivering a news item about someone else's life. Matter of fact, composed. Derek Castle was a developer from Toronto, mid-50s, financially successful, recently divorced, building something on the waterfront in Hamilton. She had met him through work. She said they had a lot in common. She said she thought they were at a similar stage in life, which was the phrase she used, and she said it twice. They were standing in his kitchen when she told him. Lily was at Sandra's that week. The house was very quiet. He said he understood. He said he was sorry it hadn't worked out. He meant both of those things. She had expected more argument maybe, or more emotion, and when she didn't get it, she looked briefly frustrated, then sorry, then relieved. She said, "You know this isn't about you." He said, "I know." She said she hoped they could be adults about it. He said they already were. She left at 7:15. He washed the 2 mugs in the sink and put them in the rack, and stood at the window for a long time without turning on the overhead light. He didn't cry. He sat down at the kitchen table in the dark, and he thought about the joint on the cabinet frame. He thought about Lily's science project. He thought about his father, who had built the shop from a garage with a single table saw and a truck he'd paid for in installments, and who had told Garrett once, standing in almost this exact same kitchen, that the worst thing a man could do was to confuse how things looked with what they were worth. Then he went to bed. 3 weeks after Joanne left, Garrett received a call from a lawyer in Toronto named Bryce Whitfield. He didn't know Bryce Whitfield. The name didn't register. He almost didn't answer. He was in the middle of a delicate cut, a tapered leg for a dining table commission. But something made him set the hand saw down and step out to the lot behind the shop where he could hear better over the dust collector. Bryce Whitfield introduced himself in the careful, unhurried way that lawyers introduce themselves when they are about to say something significant. He represented the estate of one Bernard Tulloch Fenwick, who had passed away 3 weeks prior. The name hit like cold air. Bernard Fenwick had been Garrett's great-uncle, his grandmother's younger brother. Garrett had met him perhaps 8 times in his life. The family had fractured over something his father had never fully explained, a business dispute, or a matter of principle, possibly both. Bernard had gone east and then north and had spent most of his adult life in British Columbia and Alberta before coming back to Ontario only in his final years. He was not the kind of man people told stories about at Christmas. What Garrett knew about him could fit on an index card. He was private, precise, uncomfortable at family gatherings, and he had made money in something related to resource infrastructure. Pipelines, he thought, though he wasn't certain. He'd assumed the man was reasonably well off. The kind of quietly comfortable that old men from certain families sometimes were. He had not assumed this. Bryce Whitfield explained that the estate, once tax obligations and administrative costs were settled, would transfer to Garrett in full. The figure he gave was not a round number. It had 11 digits. Garrett sat down on the stack of cedar planks he kept outside for air drying and said nothing for a moment. Whitfield asked if he was still there. He said yes. Whitfield said there was a condition. Not unusual for estates of this complexity, he explained. Bernard Fenwick had been specific about it. He had been watching his company, Fenwick Infrastructure Partners, which held stakes in several operational ventures across Western Canada, closely enough in his final years to know what it needed. It needed someone who could sit at the head of a table without the table changing who they were. He had apparently believed Garrett was that person, for reasons Whitfield couldn't fully explain, but that Bernard had committed to 3 pages of a handwritten note. The condition was this: Garrett would assume the role of interim chairman of the Fenwick board for a minimum of 90 days. During that time, he was not to disclose the transfer of ownership to anyone outside of legal counsel. He could say he was consulting. He could say nothing at all. But the terms of the inheritance required him to demonstrate, through active stewardship, that he understood the company and its obligations before the full transfer was formally completed. Garrett looked out at the lot. A robin was working in the half-frozen mud near the fence. He asked Whitfield if he could have a week. Whitfield said he could have 2. He spent the first week saying nothing. He drove Lily to school and made oatmeal and did his work at the shop. He called no one. On the 8th day, he drove to Toronto and met with Bryce Whitfield in person, brought his accountant from Ashford, a woman named Janet Coops, who had been doing his books for 16 years and who was not easily surprised, and they spent 4 hours going through documents. Janet drove home very quietly and did not say much. That night she called him and said, in her Janet way, "Garrett, you need to do this. Don't be foolish." He wasn't being foolish. He was being careful. There was a difference. He arranged for Barry Hendricks, who had been his floor manager for 11 years and who could run the shop better than most people could run anything, to take over day-to-day operations. He told Barry he had a project in Toronto that was going to take a few months. Barry asked what kind of project. Garrett said a contract job. It wasn't a lie. He kept the green pickup. He kept the canvas pants. He drove to Toronto on a Monday morning in March, parked in the underground garage of the building on Bay Street that he apparently owned a controlling interest in, and took the elevator to the 14th floor. The receptionist asked who he was there to see. He said he was there to attend the board meeting. She looked at his jacket, an old Carhartt he'd had since his 40s, and asked if he had an appointment. He said he was the new chairman. She stared at him. Then she made a call. The company's chief operating officer was a man named Philip Crane, late 40s, expensive suit, the kind of confident that can shade into contemptuous depending on the audience. He came out to reception with the kind of deliberate pace that told Garrett he had already decided how this was going to go. They shook hands. Philip Crane's handshake was firm and brief and said, "I'm humoring you," without saying it. He led Garrett through the offices, and Garrett walked slowly and looked at everything. He had always been a slow looker. It was something his father had taught him. When you walk into a room you've never been in before, don't talk. Look at what's crooked and what's level, what's solid and what's propped up. You can learn more in 60 seconds of quiet looking than in an hour of questions. What he saw: a young analyst at a corner desk comparing two spreadsheets with a yellow highlighter, pausing every few minutes to look at her screen, and then back at the paper as if the numbers were not agreeing with each other. A man near the coffee station who straightened slightly and moved away when Philip Crane passed. A closed office door with light visible at the bottom and the sound of a phone call happening inside, quickly quieted as they walked by. He said very little in that first meeting. Asked a few questions, nodded, let the operations VP run through the quarterly summary as though briefing someone who needed hand-holding. He ate the sandwich someone brought him and drank the coffee, and thanked the person who brought it by name, having read the name off her lanyard, which made her blink. He drove home that evening, picked up Lily from Sandra's, and made pasta. Lily wanted to know what his project in Toronto was like. He said it was like running a job site, except the site was larger than most. She asked if he was the boss. He said something like that. She asked if that meant he got to yell at people. He said it mostly meant listening and thinking, which she found disappointing. He went back to Toronto on Wednesday and Thursday. He began sitting in on meetings he wasn't invited to, not obtrusively, just pulling a chair to the perimeter and listening. Most people didn't ask why he was there. The ones who did ask, he told, "I'm getting up to speed." It was true. He said it without apology. Within 2 weeks he had a fairly clear sense of what Bernard had built, what it had become under its current management, and where the soft places were. There was a procurement arrangement with a supplier in Calgary that did not make sense at the rates being paid. There was a project in Fort McMurray that had been greenlit without the environmental review actually being completed. The completed review existed only in a summary memo that had been placed in the file after the fact. And there was Philip Crane's personal assistant's brother, who appeared 3 times in vendor invoices under 3 different business names. He didn't confront anyone. Not yet. He wrote things down in a small notebook in the same dense, small print he used to write measurements on job sites. He kept the notebook in his jacket pocket. He kept coming back. By the 5th week, the young analyst he'd noticed on the first day, her name was Priscilla Kwong, had started leaving brief, unmarked messages in the shared drive that appeared to be budget notes, but were actually flagging the same procurement irregularities he'd identified. She was being careful. She didn't know who he was. She was just documenting what she saw. He invited her to lunch. Not in the office. A Chinese restaurant down the street where he ordered congee, and she ordered the same thing, and they sat for an hour and a half, and by the end of it she had told him everything she knew, which was substantial, delivered in the careful voice of someone who is not sure yet if the ground will hold. He thanked her. He told her she'd done the right thing. She asked, carefully, who he was exactly. He said he was the person who was going to fix it. It was in the 6th week that he ran into Joanne. He hadn't thought much about her since February. That wasn't a performance of detachment. It was simply true. He had been busy, and the particular shape of the hurt had already softened into something more like information, the kind of thing you noted and filed and moved past. She had shown him something about herself. He had understood it. That was that. He was walking on King Street West on a Thursday afternoon, coming back from a meeting at a legal office, still in the Carhartt jacket, when he heard his name from across the street. He turned. Joanne was standing with a man he presumed was Derek Castle, mid-50s, open collar, the kind of tan that suggested winter travel south. He was the kind of man who looked very much like what he had told people he was. They crossed the street. She was warm, a little uncertain, performing ease the way people do when they're not sure how a conversation will go. She asked how he was. He said he was well. She asked how things were at the shop. He said the shop was in good hands. There was a brief silence. She introduced Derek. Derek Castle shook his hand with the confident grip of a man who measures other men that way, took in the jacket and the truck. The green pickup was at the curb, and made some rapid internal calculation. He asked Garrett what he did. Garrett said he was in the trades. Derek nodded pleasantly in the way that people nod when they've categorized you. Joanne asked, almost gently, as if she were doing him a kindness, "Are you seeing anyone?" He said he'd been keeping busy. She said she was glad. She meant it kindly. That was the thing about Joanne. She was not malicious. She was simply a woman who had looked at a man in canvas pants and a work jacket and measured what she saw against what she needed and found it short. He didn't hold it against her. He just understood her more clearly than he had before. They said goodbye. He walked back to the truck. He sat for a moment before starting the engine. He thought about Lily, who would be at Sandra's tonight, but who had asked him to pick her up on Friday and take her to her swim lesson, which he had written in his notebook next to a note about a deferred maintenance contract in the Fort McMurray file. Same notebook, same handwriting. He thought that said something accurate about his life, and he was, on reflection, not bothered by it. He started the truck. The board meeting where things came into the open happened in the 9th week. He had spent the previous 3 weeks working quietly with Whitfield's office and an external auditor, a firm that had no existing relationship with Fenwick Infrastructure Partners, to document everything Priscilla had identified, and several additional irregularities the auditors had uncovered that she hadn't known about. The procurement irregularities resolved to approximately $2.3 million over 4 years. The false environmental review had exposed the company to significant liability. The vendor invoices connected to Philip Crane's assistant's brother totaled $419,000. He called the meeting himself, which caused a brief stir. The new interim chairman had rarely initiated anything formally, which had led most people to assume he was a placeholder. Something legal had arranged to satisfy a dead man's unusual wishes. Philip Crane had spent considerable time in the weeks prior consolidating his own position, having quiet conversations with board members, letting it be known that he expected normal service to resume when the 90 days were up. 3 of the 6 board members had known Bernard Fenwick personally. 2 of them had liked him. None of them had been entirely sure what to make of Garrett. Garrett arrived early and poured himself coffee. He set a folder in front of each chair. He waited. When they were all seated, he opened without preamble. He said there were some operational matters he wanted to put in front of the board. He said he appreciated everyone's patience over the past weeks while he got oriented. He said he found he learned best by looking. Then he walked them through it. He wasn't theatrical about it. He didn't raise his voice. He used the same tone he used when he found a structural problem in a client's renovation and needed to explain what had happened and what it would take to fix it. Direct, calm, specific, without blame that couldn't be documented. He put the numbers on the table. He put the dates. He put the names. Philip Crane said, with remarkable composure, that this seemed premature, that context was needed, that some of these items had explanations that weren't apparent from the documentation alone. Garrett said he was glad to hear that, because the auditors had asked the same question, and he would welcome Philip providing that context directly to them, and suggested Philip might want to have his own legal counsel present for that conversation. The room was quiet for a moment. One of the board members who had known Bernard personally, a woman named Constance Albright, 72 years old, who had been on the board for 18 years and who wore the same sensible brooch to every meeting, looked at Garrett for a long time and then looked at the folder in front of her. She said, "Bernard was right about you." He said he hadn't known Bernard well enough to know what Bernard had been right about. But he thought he understood what the man had built and what it deserved. He proposed Philip Crane's immediate removal pending the full audit and a formal third-party review. He proposed Priscilla Kwong's promotion to acting head of financial controls. He asked the board for their vote. The vote was 5-1. Philip Crane gathered his things and left without a word, which told Garrett more about the man's actual confidence than anything that had been said in the meeting. Constance Albright stayed after, when the room was empty. She asked him how a man who ran a mill workshop in Ashford had learned to read a company that fast. He said his father used to say that a board meeting and a building site have the same basic structure. There are load-bearing elements and there are decorative ones, and the trouble always happens when someone mistakes one for the other. She thought about that for a moment. Then she said, "Bernard used to say something similar." She straightened the brooch and picked up her coat. "Thank you, Mr. Hollow." He drove home through the early dark. He stopped at the Tim Hortons on Dunmore Street, the same one near the shop, and got a large regular, same as always. He sat in the parking lot for a few minutes drinking it. He thought about calling Lily, but it was past her bedtime. He'd see her Friday. Swim lesson, 8:15. The full transfer was completed at the end of the 90 days in a straightforward procedure in Bryce Whitfield's office that took less than an hour. The news was not kept from the financial press indefinitely. These things rarely were. A brief item appeared in the Globe and Mail's report on business, noting that Fenwick Infrastructure Partners had completed a succession of ownership, with Garrett Allen Hollow assuming the role of chairman following a period of active operational oversight. The article was 2 paragraphs. It ran on Tuesday, which is the quietest news day of the week. He learned that Joanne had seen it from Sandra, who learned it from a mutual friend, who had called Sandra apparently convinced she must know more. Sandra had called him on Tuesday evening to verify that the article was about him. He said it was. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Is that why you've been going to Toronto?" He said yes. She said, "Why didn't you say something?" He said he'd been asked not to. She accepted that, because Sandra was a practical woman who understood that reasons existed even when they weren't fully explained, which was one of the things that had made them good co-parents, if not good spouses. She didn't say anything sharp about Joanne. She didn't need to. He picked Lily up on Friday and told her a version of events appropriate for a 9-year-old, which was that great-great-uncle Bernie had left him a job to look after, and that he'd looked after it, and now it was his to keep looking after. Lily asked if that meant they were rich. He thought about how to answer that and said, "We've always had enough, Lily. Now we'll just have more enough." She considered this and said that didn't sound as exciting as rich. He said it wasn't supposed to be exciting. It was supposed to be stable. She seemed slightly disappointed. He drove her to Tim Hortons and bought her a hot chocolate, and they sat at the window table, and she told him about a fight. 2 girls in her class had over a best friend necklace, and he listened to the whole thing with his full attention, the way he always did. About a month after the article ran, he received an email from Joanne. It was a careful email. She had clearly written several drafts, or she had thought carefully about what to say, which amounted to the same thing. She said she had been thinking about him. She said she hoped he wasn't angry. She said she wanted him to know that what she'd felt had been real. Even if she'd made decisions she might have made differently. She said if he was ever open to talking, she was open to that. She didn't say she had been wrong about him. She said she might have been short-sighted. There was a difference, though he understood that people who are not in the habit of apologizing rarely close that gap cleanly. He thought about it for a day. Then he wrote back. He said he wasn't angry. He said he didn't think she was a bad person. He said the thing that he remembered most about their time together wasn't the Collingwood trip, or the wine she knew about, or the easy hand-holding. It was a Sunday afternoon when she had come by the shop while he was finishing a commission piece, and she had sat in the cedar stack outside for an hour and a half and watched him work, and had not said a single word, and had seemed genuinely at ease. He had thought then that there might be something solid between them. He said he hoped she found what she was looking for. He said he genuinely meant that. He did not invite her to continue the conversation, and she did not push it, and that was the end of it. He hit send and closed his laptop and went out to the shop on Dunmore Street, where Barry Hendricks was locking up for the evening. Garrett told him he'd be back in the morning. Barry said he knew. Garrett said he'd be in early. Barry said he knew that too. After Barry left, Garrett let himself in, turned on the floor lights, and pulled the half-finished cabinet from the bench. The joint that had been giving him trouble for 6 weeks was still there, patient as joints always are, waiting to be right. He picked up the plane and worked until the seam disappeared. Then he turned off the lights and drove home on Maple Creek Road in the dark, the old green pickup ticking quietly under the stars. And there was nothing in particular to say about it, because there was nothing in particular that needed to be said.